Another question that arises from this also is that sometimes courts have big impacts, but those impacts are really full of unintended consequences, which in fact are not as positive as people who may have celebrated an actual victory in court. And let me give an example from Brown versus Board of Education, which is one of the key examples in the Rosenberg book. Many people would disagree with Rosenberg that Brown did not have significant impact. If one says, did the court change American society in a short period of time, he's absolutely right. But would raise the question that Brown was a critical moment in a developing political process. And if Brown would not have taken place, if the court not articulated Brown, that a series of subsequent events and transformations probably wouldn't have happened, although we can't ever know that for sure. But it's one thing to say that the court didn't have impact, and it is to really look at the complexity of the impact that it had. And the problem with looking at what the courts say or judges say is a standard of assessment misses the larger question about what is it that the larger movement behind the litigation is really after. And what historians have taught us is, by studies in the 1930s and 1940s, that the major issues that concerned the African American community in the 1930s and 40s was not school desegregation, but were issues about excessive police violence and lynching, issues of lack of access to good jobs and good paying jobs, and access to capital for loans for buying homes or starting small business. Those were the primary issues, and there was lots of activism around that, and at that time school desegregation was not a major issue. For a variety of reasons, the school desegregation issue is the one that made headway in court, and a variety of issues that were related to economic prosperity, equal opportunity in schools became a logic, but again, it was a secondary part of the agenda. But that's what the courts chose to in early cases before Brown, begin to give signals they were willing to hear, to listen to, and there was begin chipping away at that edifice of segregation. So then Brown articulated the issue of civil rights as one of school desegregation. It shifted what had been a movement for a variety of other rights claims and other kinds of reforms to the entire game now was around desegregation. And this desegregation model became what civil rights was about, as opposed to issues that involved jobs and access to capital and police violence, although some of those issues continued to take on. But much of the 1960s politics of African Americans who were disappointed by Brown was not just that Brown hadn't changed the world, but that those earlier agendas that mattered so much to the African American community had been displaced or marginalized or lost momentum because Brown kind of redefined the agenda. And it's not to say that school desegregation was not an important issue and that desegregating schools had positive impacts, but it's one of those unintended consequences that the shift from economic rights and to other rights that arguably are quite fundamental were lost in the shifting agendas to entirely focus on schools. It's not surprisingly in the second half of the 20th century, we think about the civil rights movement and school desegregation hand in hand. That was a curious twist of history and has a lot to do with how the Supreme Court implicitly invited cases and ruled in Brown versus Board of Education.